And here now to break down what came of the NATO summit during the president's 4-day trip to Europe is retired U.S. Ambassador to Georgia and current ambassador in residence at Northwestern University, Ian Kelly. Ambassador, thank you for your time tonight. So there were three main pillars that came out of these meetings, right? Let's begin with the first, which is sanctions. How successful have these sanctions been, and how successful has the alliance been in maintaining unity surrounding those sanctions?
Well, I think the reason why the president asked for this summit was precisely for that, to maintain the unity, to keep the pressure on Putin, to not have any sort of cracks in the alliance in terms of imposing these sanctions. So that was, I think, the main purpose of the meeting, and it's important to keep in mind that there were two other meetings too. There were three summit meetings. There was a meeting with the European Union leaders and also with the G7 leaders. And I think the thread running through all of them was the need to stay united in keeping pressure on Putin.
And of course, short of a direct conflict, a direct battle with Russian forces, the U.S. and allies have been providing arms to the resistance in Ukraine. Did anything come out of these NATO meetings or any of the other meetings in terms of initiatives or with weapons systems?
Well, I think there was quite a bit of discussions during the NATO meeting. These were, I think, sort of behind the scenes discussions about what kind of weapons we could provide the Ukrainians that would both help them fight off the Russians, but at the same time not escalate the conflict so it becomes a conflict between NATO and Russia. In terms of new initiatives, I think the main thing was an announcement that new NATO forces would go into to 4 other frontline states, NATO member states, from Slovakia all the way down to Bulgaria, which means there are now NATO forces from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. And this, of course, these are all done in a way to deter Putin from further aggression.
And what can NATO do, and what would NATO do realistically if Russia used chemical or nuclear weapons?
Well, of course, this, I think, is the kind of issue that, of course, we need to be very, very clear on. And I think that the alliance has been very clear that we would not tolerate any kind of use of weapons of mass destruction, even in Ukraine. I think that there wasn't any kind of announcement, of course, on what the alliance would do, but by putting it top of the agenda of the NATO meeting, we're showing how serious we are about what serious consequences there would be if Putin decides to use these horrible weapons.
But what could that look like? I mean, the sanctions have already been handed down. We've already said there are no boots on the ground. So what would that look like when you say that we won't tolerate it? What would the consequences be?
Well, again, this is not something we would say in public, but certainly I think that Putin does not want to have war with NATO. NATO is an alliance of 30 countries that has tremendous resources, 10 times the GDP of Russia itself. He does not want a war with Russia. And we have been very, very careful not to put NATO troops into Ukraine, not to have them become a lightning rod. There's been calls for a no-fly zone that could be put on the agenda to help protect Ukrainians. And but again, I don't think this is something that we're going to say in public exactly what we would do.
You know, we talked with a member of parliament from Ukraine the other day, and she said that engaging with Russian troops directly would not be World War III. That's their position in the Ukrainian parliament, because Putin knows that he would be up against all of the NATO countries and that he would actually withdraw. Do you agree with that position?
I just don't think we should roll the dice when it comes to that. I think that the Ukrainians are doing an extraordinary job in resisting the Russian invasion. I think that the training that NATO has given them and the weapons that we have given them have been very effective. I don't think that we've reached the point where we need to put NATO troops on the ground.
Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.